realized a trainer was being attacked by a killer whale.
12,000-pound whale actually pulled her in.
Tilikum was involved in the deaths of 3 people throughout his life.
November 1983. Off the frigid waters of Iceland, the air is cold, but the tension is colder. A crew of fishermen locks in on a pod of orcas, with their nets and harpoons primed for the kill. Just as they're about to strike, the orcas sense the looming danger. The male orcas charge forward, trying to distract the boats, while the females frantically shepherd the calves away, but there's no way out. High above, a spotter plane with its pilot's eyes locked on the target makes a call, instructing the boats to swiftly change course and reach the calves. The nets close in, ensnaring the young orcas, including a 2-year-old calf that's dragged to the Hafnarfjordur Marine Zoo in Iceland's capital. The captors give it a name, Tilikum. Flashback 5 years before this brutal abduction to SeaWorld Orlando in Florida. 9-year-old Dawn Brancheau is on a trip of a lifetime. The youngest of 5 siblings, she's mesmerized by SeaWorld's Shamu show in 1978, watching in awe as the ocean's deadliest predator performs before a captivated crowd. That's when she told her parents she'd become a whale trainer one day and work at SeaWorld. But what no one in her family could have foreseen was how this childhood dream of hers would actually come true, leading her to cross paths with the abducted Tilikum in a way that would forever alter the world's view of killer whales in captivity. Dawn Brancheau, born Dawn Therese Laverde in Cedar Lake, Indiana, had her heart set on one thing after her visit to Orlando's SeaWorld, working with the orcas. Obsessed with the idea, she shaped her entire life around that passion. After earning degrees in psychology and animal behavior from the University of South Carolina, she didn't just stop at studying animals. Outside of work, she poured her time into volunteering at a local animal shelter, caring for 2 chocolate Labradors, and keeping a collection of stray ducks, chickens, rabbits, and small birds at her home. Following her professional journey, she started off working with dolphins at Six Flags Great Adventure in New Jersey for 2 years, but in 1994, her dreams led her to the gates of SeaWorld Orlando. At first, she was assigned to work with sea otters and sea lions, which wasn't exactly what she had envisioned, but the thrill of finally being at SeaWorld overshadowed any disappointment. She soaked up every moment of it. In 1996, she married a SeaWorld stunt water skier, Scott Brancheau, and that same year, her lifelong dream came to fruition. SeaWorld promoted her to work with the orcas. That's when she encountered Tilikum, or Tilly as they called him, who had been a resident of SeaWorld Orlando since 1992. But unlike the usual captive cetaceans, this one came with a history that hinted at something far more sinister beneath the surface. Going back to 1983, after being torn from his pod, Tilikum's bad days were only just beginning. Not long after, he was separated from 2 other orcas who were abducted alongside him. They were both sold off to a facility in Brazil, leaving the 2-year-old alone, isolated, and scared. He was shipped off to a marine park on Vancouver Island of Canada named Sealand of the Pacific. That flight from Iceland to Canada's west coast must have been a grueling, soul-crushing journey for such a young orca. Once at Sealand, things went from bad to worse. He was forced into confinement with 2 other older female orcas, Hyde 2 and Nuka 5. Both these female orcas were from the Pacific Northwest, where Tilikum was from Iceland. And in orca society, every pod and area has their own unique signs and language, so from the very start, Tilikum struggled to communicate and fit in. Trapped and infuriated, Tilikum's nightmare escalated whenever he failed to meet the trainer's expectations. As punishment, all 3 orcas were denied food, creating tension between the 3 orcas. The 2 older females began harassing Tilikum, pushing him to his breaking point. Desperate to escape their brutality, Tilikum often sought refuge in a cramped back pool that was more like a crate, and was the only place where trainers could keep him safe. But the term safe was relative. This pool was a joke for a whale of any size. Even as a young orca, Tilikum was huge, and the tiny Sealand of the Pacific pools could never hold a single orca, let alone 3 at a time. Every moment spent in that confined space piled onto his agony. Then came the year 1991. After years of mounting frustration, Tilikum unleashed the first wave of the fury that had been festering inside him all along. On February 20th, a 20-year-old Canadian student and competitive swimmer, Kelty Lee Byrne, was working her shift at Sealand of the Pacific, handling the 3 orcas, when all of a sudden, she slipped and plunged into the whale pool. Before Byrne could regain her footing, the frustrated whale lunged at her, grabbing her by the foot and yanking her underwater. Panic set in fast, as the park's crew made several frantic attempts to free Byrne from Tilikum's powerful grip. But the whale wouldn't let go, even as she lost consciousness. with all 3 orcas adding to the chaos by circling and preventing any rescue attempts. When they finally pulled her out and separated the whales with a large net, it was already too late. She was declared dead. Up until that point, orcas were never known to fatally attack humans, so the authorities chalked up Burns' death to a tragic accident. But that was a fatal misjudgment. This wasn't just a freak accident. It was a calculated attack, and chillingly, it wouldn't be the last involving Tilikum. Fast forward almost 10 months to December 24th of 1991. One of the 2 Pacific Northwestern orcas, Hyde Andrea, gave birth to a calf, fueling the already simmering tensions between Tilikum and the other 2 females. The new mother was fiercely protective, refusing to let Tilikum anywhere near the main pool. The moment he tried, they would chase him back to the back pool, confining him to the cramped space for 24 hours a day, week after week. Meanwhile, after Burns' death, Sealand's management decided to sell all of their orcas to SeaWorld and shut down the park for good, with Tilikum and Nuka being shipped to SeaWorld Orlando, while Hyde and her calf were sold to SeaWorld San Antonio. Tilikum faced another grueling plane ride, this time from Canada's west coast, all the way down to the southeastern tip of the United States. At SeaWorld Orlando, Tilikum spent years confined in a tank that was again a far cry from the vast, open ocean he once swam in Iceland. To cover the distance he would have naturally swam in the wild each day, he would have had to circle SeaWorld's tiny tank over 1,900 times, which is a mind-numbing realization for a creature born to roam the open ocean. During his years at SeaWorld, Tilikum fathered 14 calves, and 4 years into this unnatural existence, in 1996, Tilikum met his new trainer, who was none other than Dawn Brancheau herself. Dawn and Tilikum quickly formed a bond, but captivity's toll on him grew more severe by the day. He was trained to perform in the Shamu show, but outside of those brief moments in the spotlight, he'd often lie motionless at the surface or bottom of the tank for long stretches every day, showing signs of severe stress and a lack of stimulation. Sometimes, in sheer frustration, he'd bite at the gates and concrete walls of the tank, damaging his own teeth in the process. And if that wasn't enough, he never felt at ease with the other orcas in his pool. There were times when they attacked him so viciously that he bled, trembled, and had to be kept out of the shows. On the night of July 6th, a 27-year-old homeless man from South Carolina named Daniel Dukes managed to hide inside the park after closing. He somehow climbed into Tilikum's pool, and what happened next still remains a mystery. When the staff returned the next morning, they discovered Dukes' mutilated body draped over Tilikum's back as the whale swam in circles. He was dead, but the most chilling part was that no one could say for sure what happened. Did Dukes accidentally drown, or did Tilikum drag him under? SeaWorld claims that there was no security footage of the pool that night to confirm. By this point, given the whale's disturbing history, it should have been crystal clear that Tilikum wasn't exactly living the high life in his concrete prison. Experts had warned the captors about the whale's stomach ulcers, which was an alarming sign of stress and inadequate stimulation, but the authorities kept on labeling the fatal attacks as mere accidents. Fast forward nearly 11 years after the second attack, and Tilikum was still stuck in the same grueling routine. The massive killer whale was paraded in shows, bred for calves, and tormented by space constraints and conflicts with other whales. However, despite the mounting stress, no major outbursts of aggression were recorded involving Tilikum, though on December 24th of 2009, another whale at SeaWorld killed trainer Alexis Martinez, but the management once again brushed it off as an accident, ignoring the troubling evidence. Eventually, the fateful day of February 24th of 2010 approached. Tilikum was set to perform at Dine with Shamu, where guests enjoyed a meal poolside while the Orca entertained. Dawn Brancheau, Tilikum's favorite trainer, was set to perform with him. They'd shared countless shows before, and this wasn't a new gig for them, but this day held a dark twist. As the show rolled on, the crowd watched Tilikum and Dawn's performance. However, near the end of the performance, you could tell something was off. Tilikum wasn't following commands, and therefore wasn't getting rewarded with fish. At the end of the show routine, Dawn perched at the edge of the pool and was affectionately rubbing Tilikum's head, lying beside him on a slide-out. At this point, you could tell Tilikum was becoming extremely annoyed. The cheers and claps turned into terrifying screams. What the spectators in the arena witnessed was Tilikum yanking Dawn by her shoulder and dragging her into the water in the blink of an eye. The panic-stricken staff rushed in, desperately trying to pry the whale from the helpless trainer, but the relentless 12,000-pound killer whale dragged her down to the bottom until she was left unconscious. For the next 45 minutes, SeaWorld's training and rescue teams threw everything they had at separating Tilikum from Dawn's body. but the aggressive whale was unmoved. Eventually they had to guide him into the medical pool, but this time with Dawn clutched in his grasp, who by now had already drowned. Once they finally managed to reach the whale, Dawn's mangled body was pulled from his jaws. The autopsy report revealed further disturbing details. Dawn's spinal cord had been severed, with her jawbone, ribs, and a cervical vertebra shattered. Her scalp had been violently torn from her head, and along her left arm and knee were dislocations. In the wake of this horrifying incident, SeaWorld Orlando banned trainers from entering the water with orcas. A prolonged legal battle followed, and on August 23rd of 2010, SeaWorld was slapped with safety violations and found to have willfully endangered its employees despite the clear warnings. Almost a year after Dawn's tragic death, Tilikum was back performing on March 30th of 2011 with rigorous safety measures. He continued in the show until he developed a bacterial infection and passed away on January 6th of 2017. In 2013, the American documentary Blackfish brought Tilikum and Dawn's story to light, casting a harsh spotlight on the captivity of orcas. SeaWorld, however, called the film misleading for obvious reasons. To this day, the tragic death of Dawn Brancheau was not her fault, nor the whales, rather the result of built-up anger after living in a bathtub for 33 years. In October of 1999, a bold protest against the ban on base jumping took place at Yosemite National Park. 5 experienced jumpers, including 60-year-old Jan Davis, aimed to show that base jumping could be done safely if they were done responsibly. Jan Davis, who was experienced at parachuting, and a base jumper who had made over 3,000 skydives and taken part in around 70 base jumps, went to the top of El Capitan, one of Yosemite National Park's iconic peaks. The cliff, rising to a majestic 3,500 feet, is a breathtaking natural wonder of granite towering over the landscape, but what was meant to be a bold demonstration of the safety of base jumping turned into something tragically different. The event was carefully planned with park rangers. All 5 jumpers had agreed to land in a designated meadow at the base of the cliff, where they would voluntarily surrender, face arrest, and have their gear confiscated. The first 3 participants leapt in perfect succession. Their parachutes opened smoothly as they glided gracefully through the air like eagles. The crowd of over 200 spectators watched in awe, their cheers and applause echoing through the sunny afternoon. The sight was mesmerizing and flawless. Yet as the crowd eagerly awaited the next jumper, they had no idea that the illusion of perfection was about to be shattered. When Jan Davis took her turn, she launched herself confidently off the cliff, but her arms stayed at her sides and her parachute refused to open. The observers, oblivious to the unfolding disaster, began to cheer, but in no time their cheers turned to horror as they realized her parachute wasn't opening. Davis plunged 3,200 feet to land on a pile of granite rocks at the bottom of the cliff. Jan Davis was one of those individuals who prepared for every eventuality, but on this day she made a fatal mistake. To avoid having her personal equipment confiscated, she chose to use a parachute borrowed from someone else for the jump. Unfortunately, she was unfamiliar with the borrowed gear, and in a critical moment, she struggled to locate the ripcord. Her own parachute was designed with a back-mounted ripcord, but the borrowed one had a ripcord positioned on her leg, a detail that proved disastrous. In base jumping, every second is crucial, and there's rarely enough time to deploy a backup chute. This small yet significant difference ultimately sealed her fate. As the whole place turned quiet, it sent shockwaves among the witnesses and friends present on the occasion. Her story features the critical importance of preparation and familiarity with gear, as well as the dangers of cutting corners. This is a stark reminder that sometimes risks, however much calculated, may lead to irreversible consequences. During midnight of Friday on February 1st of 2008, a couple of friends on holiday at a ski resort are having a blast together. They've been here with a larger group, and it's been a fun-filled adventure so far. The resort is nestled in Saus-d'Ol, a charming little town in the metropolitan city of Turin in northern Italy, near the French border. It's one of 6 villages that make up the Via Lattea, or Milky Way, a region known for being one of the largest ski playgrounds in Europe. It offers over 400 kilometers, or 250 miles of terrain, with 140 interconnected slopes and 92 lifts that reach heights from 1,300 to 2,800 meters, catering to skiers of all levels amid stunning alpine backdrops. An amusing nonsense talk beneath a ski slope end, A certain skier, a 46-year-old British guy named David Monk, who may have had a bit too much fun as well as alcohol, came up with the idea of skiing across a giant slope. While it was nighttime and visibility was near zero, this wasn't the only thing wild about it. The intoxicated group realized they didn't have a sled or anything even close to being suitable for the job, so they figured it was a good time to set up a makeshift solution. There would usually be a couple of staff around to keep things in check. It was midnight, so the place was totally empty. Taking advantage of the situation, they ripped a few foam pads off the railing and hauled them up the mountain, hiking in pitch black darkness. It took them a while, and by the time they reached the top, the early morning light had just started to break through, but that didn't make their scheme any less dangerous. The makeshift sleds they'd created now seemed like a bigger problem than the darkness ever was. Plus, they had stripped a big chunk of protective padding right from the center of the railing, so if they reached the end of the slope, they'd be crashing straight into the metal fence. The rush of excitement and their foggy thoughts totally drowned out any sense of impending danger. The only thing that could have saved them would have been if their makeshift sleds had somehow slowed down due to resistance or friction, giving them a chance to stop midway, but that never happened. David and the group launched themselves down the slope in their mattress sleds, and within minutes, they were hurling down the hill at terrifying speeds. The rubber pads proved to be as easy to slide as a sled. However, neither they could control it nor was there any protection waiting at the end of the slope. A group of people now appearing on the scene watched them barreling down the hill, cheering and shouting excitedly, and then the inevitable happened. David, leading the group down the slope, slammed right into the same spot he'd swiped the padding from. The impact was catastrophic. His head and ribs collided with the metal railing, resulting in several broken bones and punctured internal organs, and he died instantly. Meanwhile, the rest of the group, trailing behind, also went tumbling into the same gap and sustained severe injuries, but managed to survive the event. People watching the chaos rushed over as soon as they saw the group piling into the fence one after another. By the time they arrived, David was already out cold. They did everything they could to help and called for assistance, and the medical team arrived quickly and performed chest compressions on him, but unfortunately, he never woke up. During the summer of 1916, a deadly heat wave has struck the entire East Coast, making temperatures skyrocket. This, along with the terrible polio epidemic in the United States, has driven thousands of people to the seaside resorts of the New Jersey shore. Stretching 141 miles along the Atlantic, this strip had it all, from beaches to boardwalks packed with water parks and amusement parks. However, among them all, ocean swimming was the most popular. Until this time, swimming in the ocean wasn't exactly as popular as a recreational activity, but this particular summer drove thousands of tourists to the New Jersey shores. Little did anyone know that the next set of days were about to bring events so disturbing that they would turn the idea of venturing into the ocean into a worldwide fear. On Saturday, July 1st, 1916, 24-year-old Charles Epting Vincent was kicking back at the Ingleside Hotel in Beach Haven with his family. His father, Dr. Eugene LaRue Vincent, was a well-known nose and throat specialist, while Charles was trying to make his mark in business. The weekend was rolling smoothly, and Charles and his crew were having a blast on the beach, soaking up the sun before they had to head in for dinner at 6 p.m. With a bit of time to kill, Charles figured he could take a quick dip in the Atlantic before the evening would set in. Being there on the beach all day, Charles had ended up making buddies with a Chesapeake Bay retriever, so when he decided to hit the waves, the dog followed him. Just minutes into paddling, Charles noticed something was off with the dog. At first he assumed that perhaps the animal was struggling to keep up with his pace, but then he saw it turning back, swimming frantically towards the shore, abandoning him. As he continued to paddle and try to figure out the dog's freak out, a sudden icy jolt hit his left leg beneath the surface, and before he could even stabilize himself, he realized it wasn't just a jolt. Something had clamped down on his thigh and wasn't letting it go. His screams tore through the air and didn't stop before he finally grasped that it was actually a shark sinking its teeth into his flesh. Back on the shore, several bystanders, including Vincent's family, were blissfully ignorant of the horror unfolding just yards away. Among them was Alexander Ott, a champion swimmer and the member of the American Olympic team. He was there serving as a coast guard, but like everyone else, had no clue about the nightmare happening in the water. Suddenly, Charles' gut-wrenching screams were heard through the air, but the coast guard and beachgoers still thought that he was just calling his dog. Soon enough, it became apparent that something was terribly wrong when they saw Charles being pulled in the water. Alexander Ott and another bystander, Sheridan Taylor, plunged into the water, joining Charles' frantic struggle against the creature they had no idea of. In a desperate, bloody attempt, they managed to yank Charles out of harm's way, but not without taking a serious hit. Part of his thigh had been ripped to shreds. Alexander and Sheridan hightailed it back to the shore with Charles. Once they reached the Ingleside Hotel, they sought any available help, but it was too late. Charles' artery had been severed and he was bleeding out rapidly. Before aid could arrive, he died laying helplessly on the hotel manager's desk. At this point, nobody had a clue what attacked Charles. Some said they saw a fin slicing through the water before the attack, while others speculated it could be a giant sea turtle, known for its viciousness towards humans beneath the waves. In the following days, sea captains docking in Newark and New York City reported several shark sightings off the coast. But back then, the idea of a shark attacking a person was so unheard of that these warnings were brushed aside. On top of that, all of the Jersey Shore beaches stayed open without any strong warnings. This was a fatal mistake. Just 5 days after the first attack on July 6th of 1916, 45 miles north of Beach Haven in Spring Lake, disaster struck again, this time even worse. Charles Bruder, a 27-year-old Swiss bell captain at the Essex and Sussex Hotel, embarked on what seemed to be a routine swim 130 yards from shore. He had no idea the tranquil waters were about to become his worst nightmare. Just like Charles, as Bruder swam, he suddenly felt gripped by a crushing force that tore into his abdomen and legs, and before he could process what was happening, he saw the water around him turn a dark, chilling red, with his own blood staining the sea. Doing what he could, he let out a scream at the top of his lungs, desperately calling for help. His hysteric cries reached a woman nearby, to whom the scene was so unbelievable that she thought it was a capsized canoe with its red hull floating eerily on the surface. Desperate and confused, she alerted 2 lifeguards, Chris Anderson and George White, who immediately rowed out in a lifeboat to what they believed was a simple rescue mission. However, it was only upon reaching Bruder that they were struck with the horrifying reality, seeing a young man who had been savagely attacked by a beast that had bitten his legs off. However, unlike the earlier case, there was no doubt now. A shark, possibly a man-eater, was the predator. They hauled his mutilated body from the water in a desperate attempt to save him, but despite their efforts, the blood loss was too great, and Bruder tragically succumbed to his injuries before they could make it back to shore. The aftermath was a scene of even more chaos and despair. When the lifeguards reached the shore, the sight of Bruder's mutilated, lifeless body was so horrifying that some of the women on the beach fainted from shock. Following this disturbing event, the media went into overdrive, blowing up the shark threat in New Jersey shores. Shark sightings surged, reported daily from all over the area. Fear gripped the community so tightly that some people made false reports, adding to the chaos. To calm the situation down, on July 8th, a panel of 3 experts held a press conference at the American Museum of Natural History. They assured the public that while the first 2 incidents were extremely rare shark behavior, there was no chance of another attack. Though it was actually rare shark behavior, the latter part of their statement was again a disastrous misjudgment. Adding to it, the economic toll was already severe, and resorts had to remain open at full capacity without any strict enforcement against swimming in the ocean. Almost 30 miles north of Spring Lake, the town of Matawan was completely at peace until now. The news of shark attacks had reached them. The locals felt safe, as the area's location being a creek made it very unlikely for interactions between sharks and humans. However, Thomas Cortell, a seasoned sea captain from the area, had seen the unimaginable. One day, he saw an 8-foot shark lurking under a bridge in the creek. He rushed to warn the townspeople, but they dismissed his fears, attributing them to his old age. So just like the victims before them, the people of Matawan underestimated the threat at hand, and would ultimately cost them. 6 days after the second attack on July 12th, around 2 p.m., a group of local boys, including 11-year-old Lester Stillwell, were swimming in the creek. One of the boys had brought along his pet dog, which swam alongside them. As they splashed and played, they ventured into a more open part of the water near an area known as Wyckoff Dock. There, they noticed what seemed to be an old, black, weather-beaten board or a weathered log. Driven by curiosity, they couldn't resist getting a closer look, but out of the blue, a dorsal fin cut through the water. Before they could wrap their heads around it, Stillwell's scream broke the silence like a glass shattering. He was pulled into a whirlwind of thrashing limbs and chaotic splashes. The shark, with a taste for humans, had taken hold of him, and in the blink of an eye, it pulled the defenseless boy down into the depths. The group quickly realized this might be the very shark they'd been hearing about for weeks. In a state of sheer panic, they fled the water and raced down to the town for help. Among the responders was Watson Stanley Fisher, a courageous 24-year-old local businessman who came to see the scene for himself. Fisher and others plunged into the creek in a desperate search for Stillwell, but it soon became clear that finding him alive wouldn't be possible. But they were determined to at least recover his body to bring some closure to the grieving family, and they continued their search. After a grueling search for Stillwell, Fisher finally found the boy's extremely mutilated body. He hauled it up and started heading back to shore. But the man-eater, drawn by the scent of blood, sensed another opportunity. In full view of the horrified townspeople, the shark seized Fisher and tore him apart. The savage assault separated Fisher from Stillwell's body, which was then carried away drifting upstream. Fisher was rushed to the hospital, but with his right thigh severely mangled and blood pouring from his wounds. He succumbed to his injuries at Monmouth Memorial Hospital at 5:30 p.m. the same day. The search for Stillwell's body continued, eventually recovering it 150 feet upstream from the Wycock dock 2 days later. Meanwhile, in Matawan, the terror wasn't over. Just 30 minutes after the brutal attacks on Stillwell and Fisher, around half a mile from the Wycock dock, 14-year-old Joseph Dunn, his brother Michael Dunn, and their friend Jerry Horahan plunged into the river for a late afternoon swim, without a care in the world, completely oblivious to the recent horrors. As they played, a motorboat approached from the quayport, and the man on board shouted urgently for the boys to get out of the water. Michael and Jerry closest to the shore scrambled out immediately, but Joseph was still a bit away and was leaping swiftly towards the shore to reach the other two. But before he could do that, the man-eating shark had already entered those waters. The massive creature breached its immense body half out of the water and clamped down on Joseph's leg. Panicking, Michael dove back into the water, frantically trying to fend off the shark. Meanwhile, the man in the motorboat also jumped in and tried to help. He was Thomas Cortell, the very same sea captain who had warned the townspeople about the shark's danger, but was given the cold shoulder. When he got wind of the attacks on Stillwell and Fisher, he rushed to the incident site to join the shark hunt, but ended up stumbling upon another victim on the way. Michael and Thomas finally managed to remove the shark's jaws from Joseph's mangled leg, which had been torn open from knee to ankle. However, luckily he was promptly attended to by the paramedics and ended up being the sole survivor of the shark's assault. Following the second attack, several fishermen claimed to have found the man-eater, but none of these reports were confirmed until 2 days after the last attack. That's when Michael Schleicher, a taxidermist and lion tamer from a circus, landed a 325-pound shark in Raritan Bay, just a few miles north of the mouth of Matawan Creek. The shark attacked him as well and nearly sank his boat before he managed to kill it using a shattered oar. When he finally cut open the beast, he found a disturbing mix of flesh and bones inside the stomach that filled about 2/3 of a milk crate and tipped the scales at 15 pounds. Later investigations confirmed that the shark was a young great white, and the remains inside were human. Authorities identified it as the same man-eater responsible for a horrifying 12-day spree of killing. The panel at the Museum of Natural History, which had previously dismissed the likelihood of a third attack, had to publicly admit that their views on sharks had drastically changed. Now they conceded that sharks could indeed be deadly to humans at times. The main effects of these attacks is how they ignited a media frenzy, blowing the danger out of proportion and growing the public fear and hate of sharks. The headlines portrayed all of sharks as bloodthirsty creatures in the public's eyes, leading to a wave of shark hunting that devastated their populations. This fear reached a new peak in 1974 when American author Peter Benchley released his novel, Jaws. The story of a rogue great white shark terrorizing the fictional town of Amity was likely inspired by the 1916 attacks. A year later, Steven Spielberg's adaptation of Jaws further drove the wrong point home, cementing the image of sharks as relentless killers worldwide. The film's success perpetuated a terror so intense that Peter Benchley later expressed regret over his creation, acknowledging the role it played in shaping the monstrous misconception around sharks. Despite the media's portrayal, shark attacks are extraordinarily rare, with the odds being about 1 in 11.5 million. Experts suggest these incidents are usually due to mistaken identity or the shark's confusion or curiosity, yet this doesn't lessen the tragedy of those who lost their lives. Somewhere between midnight and the early morning hours of August 18th, 2005, in an old, abandoned deep cave beneath the Y Mountain, located just to the east of Brigham Young University in Utah, a group of 4 adventurers begin swimming their way out through the water-filled tunnel. It's only about 4.5 meters or 15 feet long, and these folks are not only young and enthusiastic, but also somewhat familiar with the place. With all that going for them, this stone's throw of a swim seemingly looks like a pretty straightforward job, but unfortunately, they would never make it out alive. In the year of 2005, 21-year-old Jennifer Lynn Galbraith had just finished her first year at Utah Valley State College, also known as UVSC, where she was majoring in philosophy. As the youngest of 4 siblings, she had always been full of dreams and adventure. The year she spent at UVSC was everything she had hoped for. She went into photography, played bass guitar, and even scored a few modeling gigs. Following her passions, Jennifer ran into someone with a similar profile, the leading singer of a hardcore rock band named Parallax, as well as an extremely talented painter, John Blake Donor. 24-year-old John from Springville was a third-year student at UVSC, also majoring in philosophy as well as English. Jennifer and John hit it off almost instantly. They started dating, and she joined his band. The couple also ended up being friends with many others from the circle. However, later on, their story would revolve around just 3 more people: 28-year-old Kieran Scott McDonald, 18-year-old Ariel Singer, and 26-year-old Joseph Ferguson, all working with the same band. Besides music though, there was another thing that tied them together. They loved exploring unknown places, and therefore had a bit of hiking background as well. As a matter of fact, in early 2005, Jennifer had gone spelunking in a few of the caves around town. However, the experiences weren't really ideal for her, as she had passed out in some, while ended up getting lost in others. On the night of August 17th of 2005, the band played a gig at a cafe that went off quite successfully. Afterward, Jake shared an exciting update with the group. In 2 days, he was going to review the band's first album, now that it was finally mastered. This was big news, and they were all eager to celebrate. On the way home, they decided to stop for dinner, and that's when Jennifer threw a bold idea at her friends. She revealed that one of her earlier expeditions that year, she had explored an abandoned mine on Y Mountain, which sits east of Brigham Young University. The mountain is famous for the giant Y structure made by students to honor the university, so it was pretty popular among the community statewide, even though it wasn't exactly a hotspot for cavers. Stepping into the mine tunnel, the 1.2 meter tall or 4 foot tall opening was covered by a shallow stream of water, about half a meter deep. Cavers had to crouch down and squeeze through to reach another cavern, which was a gateway to a 15-foot tunnel that was completely filled with water, ending in an even larger cavern. Here, the cavers would pop their heads up through a hole and catch a breath in the small gap between the waist-deep water and the sloped ceiling. This room, which could fit up to 8 people, was known as the Golem Cave. Apparently, the whole adventure didn't seem too dangerous, but there was a catch. The 4-foot opening, eventually narrowed down into the submerged section, was only as wide as a refrigerator door. This meant only one person could swim through at a time to get to the Golem Cave. Plus, what initially appeared to be a simple 15-foot swim would turn out to be extremely challenging. The water, fed by an underground stream and accumulated in the limestone rocks over time, was bone-chillingly cold. To make matters worse, this freezing, stagnant water was murky with debris. Even with a headlamp, visibility was next to nothing, making it dangerously easy to get disoriented and lose track of the way out. And if by chance, someone happened to disturb the debris settled on the tunnel's floor, the thick layer of muck would rise like a dark, suffocating, impenetrable cloud of silt, swallowing up any remaining visibility. In an attempt to combat this nerve-wracking disorientation, some experts from previous expeditions had tied a rope through the tunnel, securing it to the rocks at both ends. Clinging to that rope was the only reliable way for explorers to navigate through the murky water. But that wasn't much help for Jennifer, as she recalled being hypothermic during her last visit, nearly blacking out before the group managed to pull her to safety. At the dinner table, Jennifer convinced her friends to join her in checking out the cave she'd been raving about. The rest of the group, just as adventurous as her, eagerly accepted the invite. Somewhere during the conversation, they jokingly called it the Cave of Death, which of course wasn't an official term by any means, but it wouldn't take long to prove itself eerily accurate. Wednesday night, August 17th, quickly blurred into the early hours of August 18th, full of excitement. The group of 5 arrived at the entrance of the mine around 3 a.m., and after spending about an hour and a half exploring the area, they finally decided around 4:30 a.m. to begin their descent into the tunnel. However, one of the friends, Joseph Ferguson, who had come all this way to join the fun, started feeling uneasy when they got to the entrance. Despite their best efforts to reassure him, Joseph couldn't shake the discomfort, so he decided to stay behind, waiting outside the tunnel's entrance for them to return. Little did he know that that decision would turn out to be the best decision of his life. Jennifer and the crew crouched down as they made their way into the cave. With headlamps lighting their path, they began duck walking through the shallow stream, navigating the twists and turns until they hit the 27-meter or 90-foot mark. That's where they encountered the hole in the cave floor that led to the waterway below, opening into the real cave. As expected, until this point the passage got so narrow that they now had to plunge into the water one by one. Jennifer, being the most familiar with the cave, and probably the most pumped for the adventure, took the lead. Grabbing the rope, she dove into the murky water first, and the others watched as she disappeared beneath the surface. One by one, the rest of the group followed, diving into the freezing waterway, gripping the rope for guidance. Eventually, they all surfaced on the other side, emerging from the water into what they would soon know as their very own Cave of Death. As they swam through the icy water, it hit them. They really should have brought wetsuits to deal with the freezing temperatures. But at that point, there was nothing to be done about it, and they weren't planning to stick around for long anyway. The trip was just another casual adventure for them. They'd even strolled in wearing sandals and shorts, treating the whole thing like it was no big deal. But only a few moments into the chest-deep water, they started feeling the shift in the air. Once inside the cave, the breathing space above their heads was barely 1 meter. With the water being so stagnant, not only was there no fresh air circulating, but the decaying microbes in the water were steadily releasing carbon dioxide. Besides that, years of visitors passing through the cave had depleted the oxygen, replacing it with more carbon dioxide. Add to the fact that the limestone walls naturally produce carbon dioxide over time, and someone from an earlier expedition had left candles burning inside the cave, sucking up even more of the oxygen. The air in that cave had turned into a death trap. There's no way the group could have lasted more than a few minutes if they kept breathing in the toxic air. As soon as they realized the dire situation, panic took hold, and 4 of them decided to turn back immediately. But with a narrow passage ahead, only one could squeeze through at a time, leaving the rest to wait for a few agonizing minutes while the person in front made it to the other side. Otherwise, if 2 people collided in the murky water midway, there was a real risk of clogging the tunnel and drowning. The protocols, however, weren't meant for an ideal situation. These folks had just surfaced after a swim, holding their breath, and before that, they had crouched through a tight, almost 27-meter or 90-foot stretch. They were already running low on air, plus the oppressive atmosphere of the cave only added to their desperation, leaving them gasping for breath. So with their oxygen-starved brains, the ability to make a decision went right out the window. Everyone wanted to be the first to get out, but Jennifer, having already been there once again, got the first chance. The others were supposed to wait a minute or two for her to clear the path, but in their panicked state, waiting was the last thing on their minds. 18-year-old Ariel, out of breath and panicking, plunged into the water just a few moments after Jennifer, hoping her friend had already surfaced. What she didn't realize was that something terrible had already unfolded. As soon as Jennifer hit the freezing water, she desperately thrashed her limbs, trying to push through the freezing tunnel with lungs already screaming for air. Her frantic movements stirred up the debris on the cave floor, turning up the already murky water into a clouded mess. With her breath running out and disorientation settling in, she lost her grip on the guide rope and passed out just before reaching the exit hole, therefore clogging the pathway. When Ariel followed, her plunge into the water triggered a similar set of events. Then, just as she was struggling to find her way through, she collided with Jennifer's unconscious body, completely blocking her way out. Despite trying to push through, the narrow, water-filled cave trapped her too, and it didn't take long before she passed out as well. A normal person might have held out a little longer in the choked tunnel, or even attempted to swim back, but with their lungs empty and the water so murky, there was no chance to reverse course. The entire tragedy unfolded in minutes, too quickly for either of them to react. Meanwhile, the 2 men left in the cave had no clue what happened to their friends just a few meters away. Assuming the girls had already made it out, John decided to dive into the water, but the 4.5-meter or 15-foot tunnel was now restricted by 2 lifeless bodies in front of him. With no room to move forward and limited oxygen, John blacked out as well, followed by the last member of the group, Scott McDonald, who suffered the same fate. About 45 minutes after they had all entered the cave, Ferguson, waiting outside, started to feel uneasy. He crouched down and entered the cave to see if the group was still around. He made his way to the same waterhole they were supposed to emerge from, but there were no signs of movement or flashlights. Growing concerned, he decided to call out for help. If Ferguson had tried to dive in and reach his friends, he might have faced the same tragic outcome, but luckily, once again, he made the right call. When rescue teams arrived, more than 2 hours had passed since the group had gone in. Thinking they might be trapped in the Gollum cave, the rescue crew began by pumping oxygen into the cave, hoping to help any survivors breathe. When there was no response, they started pumping water out to safely enter the tunnel, a process that took another 4 hours. Once the water level was lowered, the rescue workers entered the cave, fully equipped with safety gear. Tragically, they discovered the drowned bodies of all 4 members, one after another, all facing the same direction. This confirmed that they had died while trying to escape, with their bodies ultimately blocking the tunnel. Later that afternoon, rescue workers sealed the entrance to the cave using rocks and concrete, closing it off permanently. A memorial plaque was placed at the site, engraved with the names of the lost explorers, perhaps an enduring tribute to those who paid the ultimate price for their passion. June 2nd, 1997, 3 p.m. on the dot. A female lifeguard at Waterworld USA Concord is in full-blown panic mode. Perched high at her station, she blares her whistle violently and yells at the top of her lungs, sending out warnings that are absolutely urgent. Down below her station, several onlookers are gathered with their eyes on a particular attraction called the Bonsai Pipeline Slide, a twisting, adrenaline-pumping behemoth of a ride. Over 30 students are packed at the top of it, impatient and rowdy, pushing the limits of the ride's safety rules. One after another, they're hurling themselves down the slick slide, ignoring the critical safety gaps between riders. The lifeguard's shouting gets more desperate as she waves her arms frantically, trying to stop the reckless stampede. But moments later, not only would her efforts go up in smoke, but the once lively atmosphere would take a nosedive into a dark, disturbing pit, turning into a blood-soaked calamity. 18-year-old Quimby Gelotti was a very bright student. Throughout her 4 years at Napa High School in California, she was on the honor roll, maintaining a 3.5 GPA. Besides her academic achievements, she was super involved, working as a student assistant, counselor, and peer mediator. She had her sights set on California State University at Sacramento, where she planned to study psychology in the fall of 1997. But before all of that, as her final year was wrapping up, Quimby and her classmates were hyped up for their senior trip to Waterworld USA Concord, one of the area's most popular parks known for its wild rides. In the days leading up to it, they couldn't stop planning. Every little detail of the trip was mapped out, wanting it to be an unforgettable experience. At their school, it was almost a tradition for the senior class to go on one last trip before graduation. And of course, the stories from these trips always made their way down to the juniors, keeping the tradition alive year after year. Quimby and her classmates had been through the same thing. All throughout their senior year, they'd been hearing this so-called record legend about the previous graduating class. Apparently, the whole class had climbed up a specific slide in the park at the same time, got it completely clogged on the way down, and then slid into the pool together holding hands. As reckless as it was, to a bunch of high schoolers, it sounded like pure thrill. And during the planning phase, some of them saw it as a challenge to beat that record when they got to the park. The idea spread like wildfire, and before long the whole class was in on the plan to pull off the risky stunt. As the days tickled by, excitement kept building, and then June 2nd, 1997 finally arrived. The students showed up at Waterworld early that morning, buzzing with anticipation as they piled out of the buses. Every sight of towering slides and sparkling pools had them ready to go. After a quick orientation, they scattered in every direction, fired up and ready to take on the park. By mid-morning, they had already zipped down the most popular slides, raced against each other in the wave pool, and floated down the lazy river to catch their breath. Some grouped up, daring each other to tackle the scariest rides, while others chilled, splashing around in the shallows. As the hours passed, the energy only ramped up. They had checked off almost every ride on their list, pushing each other to go higher, faster, and wilder. It was already a carefree, adventurous day so far, and now it was the time to take it to the next level. At around 3 p.m., excitement was buzzing through the group as they gathered around the bonsai pipeline slide. This monster of a slide stood more than 12 meters or 40 feet tall, towering over the entire park. Its long, twisting path was filled with heart-pounding turns, offering both a view and a thrill that was unmatched. From the top, you could see the entire water park spread out below, with the vantage point almost as dizzying as the drop itself. More than 30 students made their way to the top of the slide, climbing the stairs, eager to take the plunge. One by one, they started shooting down the slide, but soon enough, things picked up pace. Normally on a slide that high, you're supposed to wait a few minutes between riders to keep things safe, and even though they were told the rules, they completely blew them off since they had the plan to clog the slide midway, eventually going down together. What they didn't know was that they'd definitely be going down, but not exactly how they imagined. The group kept rushing down the slide one after another, not bothering to wait, and in no time, at least 33 of them were piled up on it, completely clogging the slide. In the chaos, Quimby was there too, just as pumped and excited, totally oblivious to the trouble they had created. Meanwhile, the lifeguard on duty was freaking out. At first, she tried to stop the hyped-up teens by shouting warnings and even physically blocking their way, but with just her against the wild crowd, she was pretty much powerless. Plus, everything happened so fast that all she could end up doing was keep blowing the whistle and yelling, hoping to grab the attention of other staff members, or perhaps give the kids one final warning, but nothing worked in the moment. By the time the last student came sliding down, the slide was so jam-packed that he ended up stuck just a meter down, close enough that he could almost reach back to the platform with his arm. About 30 minutes in, finally happened what was pretty much obvious. The slide was way overloaded, carrying 4 times its usual limit. While the fiberglass structure could hold more than usual, it was no match for this overwhelming weight. In front of several stunned onlookers who had gathered to witness the commotion, the bonsai pipeline slide began to bend unnervingly in the middle. The students stuck in that part of the slide suddenly realized the impending danger, and that's when sheer panic took over. Screams filled the air as those in the middle of the tube tried desperately to scramble back towards the platform, but they were trapped. Students were above and below, leaving no room to escape. It took a few seconds for the entire group to realize that the ride was collapsing, but before anyone could act, it was already too late. The slide's surface cracked at 11 meters or 37 feet in the air, sending the students tumbling down to the unforgiving concrete floor. Even the ones who were still at the top, just a few steps away from the platform, couldn't climb back. One after another, they kept falling down, their bodies crashing with a series of sickening, loud thuds. Some were knocked out cold, others were screaming in pain and terror, and a few just lay, crumbled, and motionless. Everyone around the area gasped in horror and rushed to help the injured kids. The lifeguard's panic turned to frantic action as she, alongside the others from the staff, raced to the scene, calling for emergency assistance while trying to make sense of the situation. Shortly after, one of the lifeguards, Franks, found Quimby all covered in blood and mud. Out of all 33 students, she was the worst off. Her chest was crushed, and she'd slammed her head pretty hard against the wooden support poles of the slide during the fall. Though she was conscious at first, despite Franks doing everything he could to keep her awake, she passed out on the way to the hospital and died about 45 minutes after the accident. The rest of the students were taken to 9 different hospitals where they spent weeks being treated for their severe injuries. Right after the incident, the park was shut down and an investigation kicked off. The parents of the teenagers involved, including Quimby's family, hit the park with a lawsuit claiming the slide was poorly constructed and that the park's security failed to stop the disaster. They also accused Napa High School of ignoring the students' plans after overhearing their discussions. But a few days later, the final report of the investigation came out, clearing the park of any wrongdoing. The slide met all the safety standards, and several students testified that the lifeguard at the slide station had repeatedly warned them not to try the stunt, but they were too pumped up to listen. Still, the park's parent company ended up shelling out about $4 million in compensation, with $1.7 million going to Quimby's family. Her memorial service took place at the school a week later, where 800 students gathered to bid her a final farewell. Some of them were her classmates, still wearing bandages and splints, where they may have been wondering what could have been if they just chose to enjoy themselves instead of chasing after those so-called records. October 1st, 1995. Tens of thousands of onlookers are gathered along the banks of Niagara River for an extraordinary spectacle. 39-year-old Robert Overacker is about to ride a jet ski off the edge of Horseshoe Falls, equipped with a rocket-powered parachute. Several cameras are capturing this hair-raising stunt as he enters the river near the Canadian Niagara power plant and races headlong towards the falls. Among the crowd are his family and friends, all cheering him on and hoping for the best. The plan is to plunge over the 51-meter or 167-foot drop on the jet ski, deploy the parachute, and touch down safely in the icy waters below before swimming to shore. For what he hopes to achieve, the goal is to draw as much attention as possible to raise awareness for the plight of homeless people. But moments later, tragedy struck. Born on the 4th of July in 1956 in Santa Monica, California, Robert Overacker grew up with the Pacific Ocean as his backdrop. From a young age, he was drawn to nature and the thrill of pushing his limits. Throughout his growing years, he mastered a lot of acrobatic and athletic skills, honing his talents and igniting his interest in extreme sports. However, it initially didn't seem to be a suitable profession to make a good living, so he ended up bouncing between several jobs, none of which could fit his free-roaming spirit he had. Then, during his teenage years, he fell in love with another cause that changed his life. Throughout his childhood in California, he saw the struggles of homeless people up close. For a bit of context, California has the highest percentage of homeless individuals in the US even today. There are over 180,000 people without any proper housing. While these numbers continue to rise every year back in the 1960s and 70s, it wasn't any less of an issue. Robert, who was close to nature, became passionate about helping his community. He realized he could leverage his love for extreme sports to shine a spotlight on the issue, so he started doing shows and public displays to support this cause. Though he did manage to grab some attention, it wasn't the big change he'd hoped for. Still, he kept at it, waiting for the perfect opportunity to make a greater impact. When he turned 32, he came up with this deadly plan of falling through Niagara Falls on a jet ski. It was hands down his most daring stunt yet, and the potential rewards were equally massive. If he pulled it off, he'd grab a ton of spotlight, which would help him gather the resources he needed to back his cause. The responsibility was huge, and he wanted to make sure he was fully ready. So for the next 7 years, he spent his time planning and prepping for it, even though his friends and family were continuously trying to prevent him from doing it. A couple of times, he got really close to going through with it, but kept pushing it off because of their constant disapproval. As one of the most dangerous in the world, Niagara's Horseshoe Falls dropped 51 meters or 167 feet with insane force, creating unpredictable currents at the bottom. On top of the freezing waters, jet skiing down those falls meant not only dealing with the height and impact, but also the sheer power of the river, which could make the control nearly impossible. Even with a parachute, the brutal winds could mess with deployment, making it too risky to avoid crashing into the rocky base or getting swept into lethal whirlpools. While he couldn't do much to eliminate all the risks, over the years he had come up with an idea to use a rocket-propelled parachute, also known as a ballistic chute, instead of the regular kind. These types of parachutes are used when you're close to the ground, or when the air is so unpredictable that a standard parachute might take too long to fully deploy, so the rocket propulsion attached to it helps the parachute open instantly, cutting down on the risk big time. With enough on-paper planning, Robert finally decided to go for the daring attempt in late 2001. On October 1st, he was joined by his family and a crowd of several onlookers gathered at Niagara Falls, as well as on the rooftops of neighboring buildings and restaurants, all of whom had their cameras ready to record him completing the leap. At 12:35 p.m., Robert entered the Canadian Horseshoe Falls and began jet skiing towards the edge, picking up speed fast. In just moments, he reached the drop-off, letting go of the ski as he plunged into the 51-meter fall. He went to deploy the rocket-propelled parachute strapped to his back, but unfortunately, the unexpected occurred. The crowd watched in horror as he plummeted straight into the white churning waters below, completely consumed by the massive waterfall. His parachute never opened. It turns out at the very last moment, he hadn't packed it properly, and worse, it wasn't even securely attached to him. As the water swallowed him, he vanished from sight, leaving everyone on edge. After several minutes, his body resurfaced, being tossed around by the powerful waves. At first, people thought he might still be alive because the strong currents made it look like he was swimming, but it quickly became clear that his body was just being thrown around by the force of the water, completely lifeless. 2 days later, authorities recovered his body, and he was officially pronounced dead at the nearby hospital. The cause of death was drowning since his body had no broken bones, meaning he didn't hit the rocks, and if that parachute had worked, he might have actually made it out alive. Base jumping is an extreme sport where individuals jump from fixed and altitude surfaces such as cliffs, bridges, or buildings with the use of a parachute to ensure safe landing. At the Grand Canyon, about 11 people die every year from choosing to ignore the no base jumping rule. Base jumping is dangerous but very interesting. If base jumpers are found in the park, they will be arrested together with having to pay a fine of $2,000, and their parachutes, which can be expensive, ranging from $3,000, will be confiscated. Due to this fact, most parks, including the Grand Canyon, have prohibited the practice through the U.S. National Park Service. The Grand Canyon is one of the natural wonders of the world and a popular tourist destination which attracts millions of visitors every year, and for good reason. It's stunning. But stunning backdrops are deceptive. On August 1st, one man came with a different plan. He brought a parachute to Yavapai Point, a popular point on the south rim, planning to make an illegal jump in the canyon. What should have been an exciting moment turned into his last decision as something went terribly wrong during his jump. Even though base jumping is prohibited within all areas of the Grand Canyon National Park and denoted as a high-risk activity, the man chose to disregard the ban, and unfortunately it became a fatal decision. At around 7:30 a.m., the act of the man was reported to National Park Rangers. By the time they reached the site, it was already too late. The body of the man was discovered approximately 500 feet beneath the rim of the canyon. His parachute was deployed, but something went terribly wrong in the jump. He struck the canyon wall, ending what must have seemed like a thrilling moment in disaster, and the extreme heat made it worse. There had been warnings from park officials to visitors not to engage in much outdoor activities between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. when temperatures rose well above 120 degrees Fahrenheit in places that are more exposed. The extreme conditions do not only add more risk to the visitor, but also create very unbearable working conditions for rescuers. Helicopters are limited in extreme heat, and rescue crews make numerous calls throughout the summer. County officials retrieved the man's body the next day. The crew helicopter lifted him from the canyon rim down to the bottom, where his remains were then transferred to the Coconino County Medical Examiner's office.